The NDIS is well and truly back in the spotlight tonight, with the federal government announcing 160,000 people are set to be cut from the scheme. Today, Mark Butler outlined his plans during a speech at the National Press Club.
Right now, the NDIS costs too much and it's growing too fast, put alongside any comparable government program. And unless we take action to make it sustainable, it simply will not be there in the future for the Australians who need it most. We can't afford for the NDIS to continue growing at its present rate, but far more importantly, we can't afford for the NDIS to fail.
Okay, but what does that actually mean? Now, I've previously talked about my concerns about the changes to the NDIS, but am I worrying about nothing? Well, Samantha Connor is a disability rights advocate and former president of People with Disability Australia, the national peak body for people with disabilities. She has been watching these developments closely, and I spoke to her a little earlier today. Sam, welcome to McKnight Tonight.
Hello, Rob. Lovely to be here.
Look, am I right to be concerned?
Absolutely. We held a spot meeting last night, and 200 people with disability turned up and family members. We had some advance notice of what might be landing, and certainly lived up to expectations with what was delivered today. People are absolutely horrified. I think that this is a fatal mistake for Labor, to be honest.
Sam, I should explain that you're wearing a mask because there are people around, and you are obviously a disability advocate and you need the mask to look after yourself. Butler said he's looking at a growth target of 2% for 4 years. That's actually lower than inflation. And in real terms, it means big cuts, doesn't it?
It means huge cuts. And if you think about, 2023, I think it was, when National Cabinet announced the cuts in the first place and called it a growth target, it was 16% at that time. Looking at cuts to 8% was disastrous enough, but down to 5 or 6% is absolutely catastrophic for a scheme that is meant to support our most vulnerable.
Now, look, everyone on the NDIS will be reassessed. Now, look, that happens anyway. I don't know about you, but after watching today's national address, it seems more sinister to me. Am I wrong in assuming they will be looking for reasons to kick people out of the scheme or at least reduce participant budgets?
Well, we know that they're planning to use an assessment tool called ICAN, which is planned to be used to, assess what people's functional capacity is going to be. I do love that they're going to be implementing this stuff on April the 1st, because it is funny that they're planning to do something really untested and, that is going to not, there's no precedent to this at all. So they're planning to retest everybody, do reassessments, boot off anybody who they don't consider to be disabled enough. And we're back to the old scheme, essentially, where you had to talk about what it was like on the worst day of your life, when you were the most disabled, when things went terribly wrong for you. And then you'd be, pitted against others in a race to the bottom, really, for competitive amounts of funding. And that is an absolute tragedy for something that's supposed to be Labor's landmark scheme.
Well, that's an interesting point. But the NDIS does have a PR issue at the moment. We keep seeing in the tabloids that people are rorting the system. There's, I think it's something like $1 billion they estimate is being, there are gangs getting into the money. So what's the solution to get rid of those people and help the people who need it?
When you look at the actual statistics, they have drummed up an amazing amount of hysteria about the fraud. It's less than Medicare. It's between 2 and 6%. So it's actually a remarkably small amount of fraud compared to any other part of any other social service program.
That's certainly not the perception, though.
No, it's not. And, we all like a good case of bad guys, really. The case of this is that they chose other funding priorities. We have some submarines coming in the future, probably when, all our kids are very grown up. And, they made a decision to fund some things over others. The problem is that the people who are going to suffer for this is disabled people. It'll be autistic children. and children with so-called mild impairments. And when they say that they're going back to, the types of supports that they had before the NDIS, those supports have long gone. They're not there anymore.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned kids because Thriving Kids has already been announced. Now, this is a program designed to get kids with autism off the NDIS. We got a little bit more detail about that today. Let's have a look at what he said.
Thriving Kids was built for under nines, and that work is underway. They've been the subject of agreements with states and territories. We've had great discussion about the design of that model. So that's sort of off and running, if you like, for under 9-year-olds. For people over 9, what I'm announcing today is that their functional capacity will determine whether they stay on the scheme or whether they enter the scheme in the first place. And if they have lower support needs, they won't be on the scheme in the long term, and they will return to the sorts of support systems that were in place before the NDIS. And frankly, were always intended to continue to support those people.
Functional capacity. It was the key term he used today. This worries me because people, like people on the spectrum, people can be functional, but they still need help, don't they?
Well, they can. And, it really depends the model that they've chosen on the skills and the ability of the assessor, their experience and their ability to interpret something. If you can peel a potato, then great. If it takes you an hour and a half to peel a potato, you can still peel a potato. So there's some very concerning things around this, the idea of what people can and can't do. And it's a traumatizing
So is it
thing
subjective depending on the assessor?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there was going to be a requirement for them to be a skilled person. Now that's not the case. It's something that the NDIA have pretty much made up in conjunction with another organisation. And, they're talking about doing things like reclassifying autism under psychosocial instead of neurological. And you can't redefine an international standard, so they really are.
Is that
making
literally
things
just
up.
about getting people with autism off the books?
Yeah, I think so. There's really, autism, as I say, is a spectrum. But, for example, I have a child who has autism, but also has co-occurring schizophrenia. And the NDIA are remarkably bad at looking at the whole person. They very much have counted this thing called primary disability. It's been based on, one diagnosis and not what the whole person looks like, whether they're whether they have one parent or two, where they live, what their circumstances are, and what co-occurring disabilities and other health conditions that they might have.
Okay, so there's lots of issues here. They're obviously trying to, I'm really worried about people with autism, and where they're heading with that. But was there anything they got right here and what they've announced?
No, not that I can see. They're really, I think it's a great thing that, older Australians aren't going to have to pay for showers. That's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, it means that we've traded off that people with disability have to use registered providers now for things like personal care. So if I want someone to come in and wash my hair, I have no choice as to whether it's a man or a woman now. So, I mean,
Okay.
wonderful for the older Australians, but, there's a consequence to all of these things. A lot of people have saved the government money by not using registered providers from agencies. They'll employ people for a smaller amount of hours. They'll pay them just as much, but they might pay a neighbour or someone to come and do some yard work for them and a bunch of other things for personal care. It might be somebody who you trust and who's close to you as a friend. And that's something that people have done. We're not all vulnerable people in that circumstance. The other thing they've done is they've cut social and community care, which is just wild, that people in group homes, for example, who really rely on that contact with the outside world, and that includes autistic people, who have higher support needs, that's going to be cut to 30%. And that's an absolute crying shame that we're segregating people with disability away from the world to save money.
They're looking at kicking 160,000 people off the scheme. Is there, I mean, What that says to me is it's not about actual care, it's all about numbers. And I know governments have to deal with numbers, but as a society, are we just not accepting that there are people that need help and it may be more than we anticipated? Whether, for whatever reason, whether it's better diagnosis, whether it's chemicals, whatever the reason is, we have more people on the spectrum, we have more people with disabilities. Should we just be accepting of that fact and have to manage accordingly? Or is it just harshness that they're going to kick so many people off the system?
I mean, the thing they should have done first is rolled out the recommendations of the Disability Royal Commission, which, if you remember, is the most expensive one in history. They should have made a good job of, done a good job of rolling out the Australia's disability strategy, which has not been covered in glory for the last 2 decades. Really, there's just been so little done in the area of disability and inclusion that we're in this state now when tough times are upon us. The government shouldn't be fair weather friends, that people with disability are people who are already disadvantaged, who are already too close to the edge every day of our lives. And to make cuts there instead of other policy areas, I think is just harsh.
What happens next? People like you don't like what's happening. You're talking to other disability advocates. Is there anything that can be done?
Well, I think they've got a bit of a fight on their hands. There's how many days until budget? 12th of May, I think it is. I imagine that, our community is not just in shock, but furious. Last night, when people listened to the advance notice that we had of changes, which came from some friendly providers, by the way, they didn't tell the disability sector, none of the disabled persons organisations, etc. It was all about, speaking to the providers. And when we talked to people, they were absolutely stunned that that this government could do that to people with disability. The other thing is we went back to the Every Australian Counts campaign, which people are increasingly supporting and donating to every day right now. That's back to being the campaign that fought for the NDIS. And the people who actually were holding up signs and making a pledge to have this world-leading scheme called the NDIS were people like Richard Miles, Mr. Butler, Mr. Chalmers, and a very young Anthony Albanese. And so they made a promise then to make sure that the NDIS would be a world-leading scheme that would support every person with a disability in this country and our families. And I know that politicians do sometimes break their promise, but it would be a wonderful thing if they would reconsider this before the budget. If they like war, they've got a war on their hands now.
Yeah, look, I've been a big supporter of the NDIS. I think it's been a great system. It's helped a lot of people. I don't like what they're doing now. If you need to get any other messaging through, if you've got any updates, please come back. Disability rights advocate Samantha Connor, thank you so much for joining us on McKnight tonight.
Thanks so much, Rob.
You can show your support for the show by buying me a coffee. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/McKnight tonight. Every bit helps keep this show from our garage going.